Chapter 16, The Other Constitution. Sailing ships use wind for power. No wind, no power. Picture a fleet of full-rigged British naval vessels with no breeze in the air. They're stuck. Becalmed is the nautical word for it. That was the situation at the mouth of the New York harbor on July 17, 1812. The USS Constitution was surrounded by a British fleet. That handsome American ship, one of 6 frigates, ordered when George Washington was president, was a sitting duck. As soon as the air stirred, it looked as if she would be blown from the water. What would you do? The Americans kedged. That means they put a light anchor from the ship into a rowboat, rowed ahead, dropped that anchor called a kedge. Sailors on board the Constitution then pulled on the rope until they reached the anchor. They kedged again, and again, and again. After 3 exhausting days, they'd cover a distance. So, when a breeze finally came, they were able to escape their enemy. That was just one of the exploits that made the Constitution special. A month later, in that same war of 1812, the Constitution took on British frigate HMS Guerriere, and in a famous battle destroyed her. Cannonballs from the Guerriere kept bouncing off the sides of the Constitution. "Huzzah! Her sides are made of iron!" shouted a sailor who was there, and so, after that, she was often called Old Ironsides. The ship was actually made of wood, with thin copper sheathing to keep the ship's worms away. But it was no accident that she withstood cannon fire. She was a symbol of the best of American craftsmanship. She had been built at Edmund Hart's shipyard in Boston. Each of her sister ships, the Chesapeake, Congress, Constellation, President, and United States, was built at a different American shipyard from Norfolk, Virginia to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. They all followed the exact specifications of a Philadelphia man, Joshua Humphrey, who had designed the bigger-than-usual frigates. The Constitution's hull was 25 inches thick, with live oak at its center. Live oak, which grows in coastal areas of the South, like where I live in Virginia, is said to be the toughest wood in the world. Humphrey had ordered the best white oak for the keel, the ship's backbone, and the best Carolina pitch pine for the decks. Her giant masts, from which the sails hung, were made from towering New Hampshire pines. The 36 sails were sewn from canvas woven in Rhode Island. Boston's Paul Revere bid to supply the copper bolts that held the ship together. He said he could do it as cheap as anyone, and as well. He was right. He got paid $3,820.33 for 15 tons of copper fittings and a ship's bell. A few months after the encounter with the Guerriere, the Constitution whipped HMS Java, even though the Constitution had lost its steering wheel and was hardly able to maneuver. The British Admiralty, the head naval office, issued an order to British ships. They were not to get involved with the American 1-to-1. They had to outnumber them in order to engage them in battle. The USS Constitution was famous even before the War of 1812. She was part of the official birth of the U.S. Navy. That was in 1794, when President Washington ordered those 6 cannon-toting frigates. At the time, the new nation had no navy. The colonies had put together one during the War of Independence. It was made up of merchant ships and fishing schooners, some 2,000 privateers, along with a few warships and a small fleet that Benjamin Franklin brought in from France. Read about John Paul Jones for more about the Revolutionary War Navy. Great Britain was the world's big naval giant, but America's scrappy and surprising sailors had played a decisive role in that fight for freedom. After the war, the Navy was abandoned. When Americans went to sea, and lots did, it was for trade. Our merchant ships were soon plying the Mediterranean. For centuries, North African states had demanded bribe money from anyone who wanted to sail that sea. Then called the Barbary States, they are today's Libya, Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco. Barbary pirates, called corsairs, made things unpleasant for anyone who wouldn't pay up. In 1787, the U.S. government signed a treaty with Morocco agreeing to regular bribe payments. For a while, American ships were left alone, but in 1793, 8 American ships were seized. By February 1794, 126 Americans were being held as slaves in the city of Algiers. More were captured. Something had to be done. Americans now wanted a navy. That's when President Washington authorized those 6 frigates. In addition, 5 other warships were built privately and sold to the government. Some smaller vessels were bought and covered, and privateers were made fit to fight. In the meantime, Algiers was demanding protection money, and there didn't seem to be much choice except to comply. In 1796, the president paid a peace ransom of almost $1 million. The U.S. sailors were released, and for a while, American ships sailed freely. By the time Jefferson became president, the United States had paid the Barbary States almost $2 million. Still, the Bey, or ruler, of Tripoli is a city in Libya, didn't think he'd gotten his fair share. So, in 1801, he declared war on the United States. It was a war that plodded along until 1804, when a task force with Hurrah, the USS Constitution as a flagship, began pounding Tripoli with cannonballs. But as an American ship, the Philadelphia ran aground. It got stuck on unmarked reefs. The Barbary Corsairs captured its crew of more than 300 sailors. They intended to float the ship and to use it in the fight against the American fleet. That's when Lieutenant Stephen Decatur, in a small captured schooner called Intrepid, sailed into the harbor at night, climbed aboard the Philadelphia, set her afire, and got away. Meanwhile, the American consul in Tunis, William Eaton, was getting ready for his own heroic actions. Eaton's story is complicated. You may want to read more about it on your own. He hated the pirate princes, and he didn't think the American bombardment would have lasting results. So, he put together a motley force of Americans, Greeks, and Arabs on a fleet of camels and marched 500 miles from Alexandria in Egypt across the Libyan desert to Darna. He attacked that town. It's in eastern Libya, and with the help of the American warships, he captured it. All that led to a new treaty with Tripoli, signed on board the Constitution, and the release of the captive sailors after a ransom payment. Pirates, they're just thieves on water, complicate the world. But they did help provide us with the Navy, and they helped make the Constitution famous. Her exploits in the War of 1812 added to her fame, and so did a story of her first voyage when a captain of a British frigate taunted those on the Constitution, betting a cask of fine Madeira wine that he could beat them in a race. He handed over the wine. So, in 1830, when a story in the Boston Advertiser said that the USS Constitution was to be scrapped, lots of people were upset. The story was wrong. The Navy was actually planning to overhaul the ship, but a young medical student, Oliver Wendell Holmes, didn't know that. He sat down and he wrote a poem called Old Ironsides. It captured the public's imagination and was soon reprinted all over the nation. The Constitution had been famous before, but that poem made it even more so. Children in school were soon memorizing it. In 1844, the ship embarked on a round-the-world voyage that included visits to 25 foreign ports for diplomatic, scientific, and business affairs. She was seen as a symbol of the United States, and her name added to that image. In the 1850s, Old Ironsides became a flagship of the African Squadron. That squadron was organized to patrol the west coast of Africa to keep slave ships from sailing illegally for the United States. The Constitution captured one of those slavers. After that, she was mostly used as a training ship. By the end of the Civil War, all 5 of her sister ships had been turned into scrapped. In 1897, Massachusetts Congressman John Fitzgerald had moved her to Boston for her 100th birthday, but the old ship was beginning to wear out, and someone suggested she be used for target practice. That enraged some Americans, including a group of school children who helped raise more than $600,000 to restore the ship. In 1847, another anniversary, the U.S. Post Service issued a commemorative stamp with a picture of the 3-masted frigate. It then cost 3 cents to mail a first-class letter. In 1997, she celebrated her 200th birthday by sailing under her own power into Boston Harbor. Today, the Constitution is still a commissioned warship and is the world's oldest still afloat. She is docked in Boston and visited by nearly 1 million people a year. Now back to land in the 19th century. It is 1817 and a new president is taking office.